Hello, I'm John. Got a reading update for you today. Been doing quite a bit of reading, and we'll just get right into it. So, the first book I read this week was Ghosts from the Past by Glen Ebisch. This was okay. It's almost a cozy mystery without being a cozy mystery. Follows this reporter named Marcy. She works for a glossy magazine, the kind you might get from the electric company or something like that every now and then. And she's been called by an old man in Vermont who says he has information on a triple murder that took place in his grandfather's barn in 1943. And he refuses to tell her anything about it unless she comes to Vermont and talks to him in person. So she goes to Vermont, and then he refuses to tell her anything else about it unless she pays him a lot of money. And she thinks that the story is not right for their magazine, and she also feels like he probably doesn't actually know who killed those three men. So she leaves, and she meets a reporter from from a newspaper. He works for his father's newspaper, and he's got a lot of, um, tension with his father. They don't get along. His father's kind of a hard-driving businessman type who wants everything done his way, and he really doesn't want to do that sort of thing. So they meet up, they have dinner together, and you know, there's kind of that will they, won't they get together kind of thing going on. But it becomes very clear something is wrong because the police chief shows up and wants to talk to Marcy because the old man has been killed. He's been drugged and hanged just like the men in 1943. And so she's a suspect. Kevin is a suspect. And there's the idea that it could be related to these murders from, 70 years ago. And, it's like a Hallmark movie kind of thing where everybody in the small town is in each other's business. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody's kind of related. Everybody remembers everything that happened back into the 30s. And, there are inns and that sort of thing. Very cozy without being a cozy mystery. And I kind of find that a little overdone, but to be honest, I find that overdone in every instance of it because it's not something that correlates to what I know about the world. So it becomes clear pretty quickly that we have two main suspects, the chief of police and I believe he's a congressman who is also a lawyer, and he handled the old man's will. And it's pretty clear that it's one of those two guys because both of their great grandpas had something to do with this murder. The police chief's great grandfather was also the police chief who didn't solve the murder. And then I can't remember what the other guy's great grandfather did, but there was reason to believe that he might have been involved in that murder also. And so it's one of these two guys killed Cell to cover up the information that he had about the murder in 1943. And it was okay. My one real problem with this book is that I felt like the tension was never high enough. I always felt like Marcy and Kevin were going to live and they were going to figure out who did the murder. And, it wasn't bad. It was just an enjoyable read. And I think I'd read other books by Glen Ebisch. I really didn't have a problem with that. I just wish that there had been more tension. So, yeah. And the next book I read was The Daffodil Affair by Michael Ennis. This is a complicated book, a convoluted book in a way. So this is a John Appleby mystery. He's a detective who lives in London. And there's another detective called Hudspeth, and he also lives in London. And Appleby has been sent to track down a missing horse. There is a believe, a sister of an earl who takes a horse-drawn carriage every day, and she liked Daffodil the horse, and someone has stolen Daffodil. And so Detective Hudspeth he works missing girl crimes, so he has a very cynical outlook on the world because he's always seeing all these bad things that people are doing to young women and young girls. And so he has a lot of, he sees those kinds of crimes everywhere he looks. He thinks that he sees them, and he thinks he knows what's going on. And there's a young woman named Lucy who, in the parlance of the times, is described as being feeble-minded, who is I believe she's a waitress, and she goes missing, and he goes to talk to her family. And this is where my problems with this book kind of started. They are lower class, so they're like maids and that sort of thing, maids, waitresses, and the way that Innes writes about the British lower class really bothered me. And to be honest, anytime I read about the British class system, I get really bothered by it. It's really irritating. It's like, for in this book, for instance, it's kind of a question of breeding and of blood. It's not a question of we don't pay these people enough money so they can't afford an education. It's they come from bad blood. They are lesser people, and they can't be educated. They can't have any class. They're stupid. That's kind of how not only Hudspeth approaches the family, but also kind of how Michael Innes approaches the family. That really bothered me. And there's a lot of that, like, you know, lower class, drop their H's kind of dialectic. And I really don't like all that. I really don't like to see somebody piss on poor people. It makes me angry. And anyway, so the trail between Appleby's search for Daffodil and Hudspeth's search for Lucy intersect. And it also intersects with the fact that a haunted house that Samuel Johnson wrote about has vanished overnight. It's 1942, 1941. The war is on. Houses are getting bombed all around London. And so, nobody has really noticed that this house has gone missing, but somebody has completely dismantled it and taken it away. And at the same time, there is a witch who lives in a village, or she's supposedly the relative of a witch from years ago, and she has sold her house and her cauldron and her broom and claims to be going to Capri. And all these things intersect, and Appleby and Hudspeth wind up going to South America. And there's a man named Mr. Wine, Mr. Emery Wine, and they meet him on the ship. And there are also some strange people on the ship, like mediums and stuff like that, automatic riders and things. And it becomes clear that Mr. Wine is collecting psychics and mediums and telepaths and all these sorts of people and taking them to South America to live in this really weird utopian compound kind of thing. It's like he wants to start a new religion. And yeah, it gets weirder from there. And it had some really good elements to it, but I just felt like it wasn't written very well. I liked the actual writing, the prose itself. It's a little hard to follow sometimes, but it was just kind of outlandish, and I didn't always understand how the detectives came to their conclusions. And there was a really kind of ridiculous moment where Appleby cures a young woman's multiple personality disorder by insulting her other personalities until they go away, which was just kind of goofy. And, there's a lot of that casual racism sort of thing in this, and I just didn't get along with this book. I mean, I thought there were good elements, but mostly I just didn't like it. And I read some reviews of this that said this is not one of the better Michael Ennis novels, so I might give him another chance. I think I have another one here somewhere, but this one was just too convoluted. I just didn't like it. So the next book I read was Prisoner of War by Kenneth Simmons. Yes, Kenneth Simmons. So in 1944, he was a bombardier on a B-24 Liberator flying over Germany to bomb Mainz, and his airplane was hit with flak, and everyone aboard had to bail out over Germany. And so some of them lived and some of them didn't, and they were all split up all over the place. And now he and his pilot and another man were taken to a place called Stalag Luft, which was kind of like an interrogation prison. And all they really did to him was they locked him in solitary confinement for about a week and a half and fed him bread and water, and then they'd bring him out and talk to him and just trying to figure out what was going on. And they would lie to him and all this and use information they had to try to convince him that his friends had, given them information, because they're not allowed to say anything but their name and their rank and their serial number. That's all they're allowed to give. And eventually he was let go out of that, and he was sent to Stalag Luft 3, which I believe is the same camp from The Great Escape, which, unlike in the movie, the Americans and the British and the Canadians were kept apart. So the British and the Canadians were kept in one part, and the Americans were kept in another part. And, it didn't sound all that bad because they had a lot more resources than average Germans at the time. They were receiving care packages very often from the American Red Cross. So they had cigarettes, they had coffee and food and everything like that. They had a library with 7,000 volumes. And, he still gets kind of involved in, they're trying to dig a tunnel out of there so they can send just one man with some information across out of Germany into France to give the information to the Americans. And he lives there for a couple of months, and then as the Russians approach, that's when things really get bad for him and for his friends, because once the Russians get within 20 some odd miles, the Germans decide to move them in the middle of a snowstorm. They burned Stalag Luft 3 and marched these guys through this terrible snowstorm, and a lot of them died. They got pneumonia and all sorts of things. And Kenneth Simmons got pneumonia and thought he was going to die. At one point, he was spitting up blood and everything. And they would cram them into churches, several thousand men into a church all at once, and arm to arm, elbow to elbow, and everybody is sick and puking, and they have dysentery and all that. And this goes on for several days. They were going to move them from Stalag Luft 3, which is it's now in Poland, I believe. They were going to move them to Berlin. So it's like almost 200 kilometers, I believe. And yeah, then the general who is the head of the Americans in this prison camp, cuts a deal with the commandant of Stalag Luft 3 and says, I don't want my men taken to Berlin to be held hostage, basically. And can we take them somewhere else? Because this war is about to end, and I know you don't want to be hanged, so let's send them somewhere else. So they make a deal where they send some of them to Nuremberg and some of them to another prison camp, Stalag 7A. And they send them there in cattle cars. And it takes several days to get where they're going, so it's freezing cold. And they're packed in like sardines. And they have a cardboard toilet that overflows very quickly. And not everybody lives through that journey. And once they get to Stalag 7A, there are lots and lots and lots of men in this camp. And I think they stay there for about a month and a half. And they don't get as much food and that kind of thing. And along the way, some of his friends have died. Some of his friends got sent to Nuremberg, and he learns later on that they died of pneumonia. And eventually George Patton shows up, with his army, and they're the ones who enter into Stalag 7A. And yeah, it was just really good. I liked the way he wrote. His dialogue is a little bit stilted. He wasn't a big fan of contractions, so a lot of the things they say to each other seem kind of stilted, and I don't know if that's a reflection of how they were actually speaking to one another, or if that's just how he remembered they were speaking to each other. But I thought it was really good. This has, one of those wraparound covers. Most of these are silver, but this is a later one from the 80s, 88, I think, and they had gold covers. And yeah, I enjoyed it. It was pretty good. I found a little bit of it to be a little bit hard to believe, like the parts later on with General Patton. Like, I mean, it's all possible. It's just that I've learned to be a little bit skeptical of books like this because we have to take the author's word for it. Last year I read a book called Kamikaze, and it turns out that book was completely fabricated from beginning to end. And that really made me angry. Turned out the guy had never been a kamikaze, never been a pilot. He spent the entire war working in a factory. And so I've just learned to be a little bit skeptical, but I believe Kenneth Simmons. I've tried to look up a little bit about him, but I couldn't find anything. But this book is not like Kamikaze. Kamikaze was outrageous to the point where halfway through it, I was thinking, yeah, right. But this book is believable, and there were several thousand men at Stalag Luft 3, and so I'm not saying that that didn't happen. I think it did happen, and yeah, I thought it was pretty good. It's worth checking out if you're into that kind of thing. So the next book I read was also the number one choice for my Quick to Judge challenge, and that is Listening Woman by Tony Hillerman. And this takes place down on the Navajo Tribal Reservation in the, I think, Arizona and New Mexico area. And starts out in the beginning. There's an old blind woman who is trying to use traditional healing methods to heal this old man who won't tell her exactly how he became sick. So the Navajos in these books, they believe in the old ways, the old, like if you did this, then you'll get sick this way and that sort of thing. So she's trying to work out what he did to make himself sick, and she can't figure out if he is maybe a skinwalker, maybe he is a witch, but he won't tell her. He just gives her some information that's a little bit weird, and she goes off to be alone and meditate on how to heal him, which which song to sing, basically. And when she comes back, nobody will answer her, and she finds them both dead. The old man and her assistant, who's like a 16-year-old girl, they're both dead. Turns out they've both been beaten to death with a pipe. And Lieutenant Joe Leaphorn of the Navajo Tribal Police, comes in to solve this murder. It's been several months since it happened. Nobody could solve it. Nobody figured out. It didn't make sense, right? Why they would kill the old man and the young girl, but leave listening woman alone. And yeah, so it's pretty good. It's got some. It's a little bit loose. It's a little bit. The narrative is a little bit loose, but I enjoyed it. And you know, we get these other elements of like there is a priest who is being chased by a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, beautiful white woman who is after forbidden fruit, basically. And we get to hear that there might be something that the old man who got murdered was hiding, some ancient, like some Navajo songs and some dances that were, well, they were kind of obliterated out of existence by the United States Army in the 1800s. And only one man knew those dances, and it was the old murdered man's great-grandfather. So there's a potential that these dances have been passed down to the old dead guy, and maybe he was hiding those. So there's also a splinter group from the American Indian movement, and they felt that the American Indian movement wasn't forceful enough, wasn't violent enough, wasn't doing enough after I want to say it was in 1973 where they took over Wounded Knee. And so they split off and they started robbing banks and all this kind of thing, and they're progressing into serious violence, and that's also mixed up in this plot. And I really enjoyed it, but I feel like there were some loose elements to the plot, but I wish would have been tightened up a little bit. But it was really good. I like the way Tony Hillerman writes, and if you haven't read Hillerman, you should give him a chance. Just any of his books would be a good place to start. You don't have to start at the beginning or anything like that. They do progress as time goes by. Lieutenant Leaphorn gets older and that sort of thing. Just a really good book. And the last book is A Murder of Quality by John Le Carre. This is a George Smiley book and one of Le Carre's earlier novels. So it takes place at a public school in Britain called Carre. And I never could work out if she was an actual teacher or if she just worked there. She was the wife of a teacher, and they're not called teachers. They're called something else, but I can't remember the term at the moment. And she is killed in her house, and the suspect at first is her husband. And the murdered woman had sent a letter to a newspaper asking for help. And the lady who writes under a pseudonym, kind of a Dear Abby type pseudonym, gets this letter, and she doesn't want to call the police, so she calls her old colleague George Smiley, who had been in intelligence work in World War II. This is kind of the early days of George Smiley, so he's not fully, his backstory and everything isn't fully fleshed out yet. And Smiley goes off to this school. He worked with the brother of the headmaster in intelligence. And so he kind of has a easy way into this murder, into this investigation. And he goes up there and he discovers this school of all these teachers who are spiteful and petty and hateful and extremely class conscious and just awful, awful people who don't really care about educating the kids at all. You know, they just gossip and are just so mean to each other. It's like that's all they live for, is to just be awful. And Smiley gets all caught up in this trying to figure out, who did this murder. And it was just really good. I really enjoyed this one. It's really bleak, and I don't really want to say too much because it would kind of give the plot away. It's the middle of winter, it's snowing and cold and dark, and at the same time it's also, now in this book, Smiley is described as being divorced from his wife. This is where his wife grew up, and he doesn't really want to go there because he'll be thinking about her the whole time. And so in later novels, they weren't divorced, they were just, his wife Anne was always running around on him, leaving him for other men and then coming back and then leaving him again and that sort of thing, cheating on him with his own colleagues. And yeah, so I don't know, I just really liked it, and I liked the way that Smiley was described in this book, so I thought I would explain that a little, or read that. It was a peculiarity of Smiley's character, but throughout the whole of his clandestine work, he had never managed to reconcile the means to the end. A stringent critic of his own motives, he had discovered after long observation that he tended to be less a creature of intellect than his tastes and habits might suggest. Once in the war, he had been described by his superiors as possessing the cunning of Satan and the conscience of a virgin, which seemed to him not wholly unjust. And here's a little bit more. Smiley himself was one of those solitaries who seemed to have come into the world fully educated at the age of 18. Obscurity was his nature as well as his profession. The byways of espionage are not populated by the brash and colorful adventurers of fiction. A man who, like Smiley, has lived and worked for years among his country's enemies learns only one prayer, that he may never, never be noticed. Assimilation is his highest aim. He learns to love the crowds who pass him in the street without a glance. He clings to them for his anonymity and his safety. His fear makes him servile. He could embrace the shoppers who jostle him in their impatience and force him from the pavement. He could adore the officials, the police, the bus conductors, for the terse indifference of their attitudes. But this fear, this servility, this dependence had developed in Smiley a perception for the color of human beings, a swift feminine sensitivity to their characters and motives. He knew mankind as a huntsman knows his cover, as a fox the wood. For a spy must hunt while he is hunted, and the crowd is his estate. He could collect their gestures and their words, record the interplay of glance and movement, as a huntsman can record the twisted bracken and the broken twig, or as a fox detects the sign of danger. So, yeah, I thought that was really good. And Le Carre was a really good writer, even though he, his plots aren't always plots that I particularly want to read, because he focused a lot on like men and women who were cheating on their partners, and a lot of times like multiple partners at the same time while being spies and that sort of thing. That's just not really my cup of tea, but I like the way that Le Carre wrote. It's been a long time since I've read one of his books, and I just enjoy getting back into this one and following George Smiley a little bit more. So that brings us to the end of the books I read in the last week. And I don't know how long I'm going to stay on this roll, but I've been reading a lot of books, reading a lot of fiction, and I've really been enjoying it. So I've been trying to teach myself to read without sub-vocalizing, and I'm making progress in fits and starts. Like, particularly when I was reading this book, I was reading like whole pages without sub-vocalizing, just doing a great job. And I was really surprised at that because I really didn't believe that you could understand a word without sub-vocalizing it. And I have found that that is not true. I can understand words just fine without sounding them out of my head. I didn't believe it. It's the truth. And it really has sped up my reading. But like I said, it's coming in fits and starts. So sometimes I remember to try to do it. Sometimes I'm just so used to reading the other way that I forget to try. And I'm easily distracted out of it. I'll go for a little while and then I have to turn the page or something makes some noise and I go back to reading while sub-vocalizing. And there are some times when I'm doing it and then I realize I don't remember anything I just read. So it's a skill, and it's a skill I'm gaining, and going back and forth. It's going to take some time, but it's really helping me read faster, and I'm understanding what I'm reading while I'm reading faster. So it's really nice. I didn't think it was possible, but it is. So anyway, we'll cut the video here. This will be the end, and I wanted to thank you if you've stuck around for this long, and I hope that you will return for the next video, and I'll see you next time.